Margaret Ellis didn't ask permission. She grabbed the cast iron skillet off the floor, turned to face 16 men who were laughing at her, and slammed it down on that broken stove so hard the whole bunkhouse went quiet. Then she looked straight at the man who'd just called her a mistake, looked him dead in the eye and said, "You want to eat tonight, or you want to keep running your mouth?" Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word. Before we go any further, if this story is already speaking to something in your chest, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now and follow this channel. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me, and I promise you the story you're about to hear is one you won't want to miss a single word of. Now, let's go back to Wyoming. Let's go back to 1886, and let's find out what happened when a woman nobody believed in walked into a broken kitchen and refused to let anybody take her dignity. She was 31 years old, and she had exactly $42 and a dead husband's name to her name when she climbed down from that stagecoach in Clearwater, Wyoming. The wind hit her before anything else did. That dry, bitter Wyoming wind that didn't care who you were or where you'd come from. It just pushed right through your clothes and reminded you that this land didn't owe you anything. Margaret Ellis pulled her dark blue prairie dress tighter around her shoulders, picked up her 2 travel bags off the coach step, and set her feet on the ground like she belonged there. She did not look uncertain. She did not look frightened. She looked exactly like a woman who had already survived the worst thing the world could throw at her, and had made a private decision somewhere on that long coach ride from Dodge City that she was not going to let anything in Wyoming break what Kansas hadn't managed to break. What Kansas had done to her was something she didn't talk about freely. What Kansas had done was take her husband in a railroad accident 3 years prior, leave her with a daughter named Clara, who was 7 years old, and already asking questions. Margaret didn't have good answers for, burn through what little savings Thomas Ellis had left behind, and then slowly, methodically let every door in that town close in her face one by one, until the only thing left to do was answer a stranger's advertisement in a newspaper and climb on a coach heading west. She had answered 12 advertisements in the months following Thomas's death. 11 of them never wrote back. The 12th one was from a man named Caleb Whitaker, who ran a cattle ranch up in the mountain country outside Clearwater, and who had written in plain direct language that he needed an experienced cook for a crew of 15 ranch hands, that the work was hard and the days were long, and that he expected reliability above all else. He had not asked about her size. He had not asked about her appearance. He had asked if she could cook for a large crew. Margaret had written back and told him she'd spent 3 years feeding 40-man railroad crews in Kansas, that she could stretch a dollar further than most men could stretch the truth, and that she had never in her working life failed to put a hot meal on the table when one was needed. He had written back with one word: "Come." So she came. What Caleb Whitaker's advertisement had not mentioned, what Margaret had perhaps not fully prepared herself for, was the audience. There were 7 ranch hands standing in the yard when that stagecoach pulled up to the Whitaker Ranch gate. 7 men who had clearly been given some kind of advance warning that a new cook was arriving, and who had apparently come out to form an opinion before the dust even settled. She heard one of them before she saw any of them. "Lord have mercy," a man's voice said. Low, not quite quiet enough. "He sent for a cook and got himself a—" She didn't hear the rest of the word because the wind took it, but she didn't need to hear it. She had heard every version of that sentence that existed. She had been hearing it since she was 16 years old, and already knew she was built differently than the women in her town expected women to be built. Margaret Ellis was a large woman. She had always been a large woman. She had the kind of body that strangers felt entitled to comment on before they'd learned her name, the kind of shape that made certain people decide her worth before she'd opened her mouth. She was not soft about it. She was not ashamed of it either. It was simply a fact about herself, the way brown eyes were a fact, the way her late husband's ring was still on her left hand, the way her daughter was currently sitting inside that stagecoach waiting for her mother to handle this situation. And this situation was Caleb Whitaker. He was standing apart from the other men, just slightly the way a man in charge tends to stand without quite meaning to. He was taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't had any particular expectation. He wore a dark coat and a hat that had seen considerable use, and he had the kind of face that had been made angular and still by years of hard weather and hard decisions. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized and respected. He was calculating, not laughing, not smirking, just looking at her the way a serious man looks at a serious problem, trying to decide how the pieces fit. She respected that more than she would have respected cheerfulness. She set her bags down. She straightened her dress, and she walked toward him with her hand already extended because she had learned a long time ago that you didn't wait for people to offer you courtesy. Sometimes you had to extend it first and watch what they did with it. "Margaret Ellis," she said, "from Dodge City, by way of Abilene. I'm your cook if you'll still have me. You'll still." Caleb Whitaker looked at her hand for exactly 1 second before he shook it. His grip was firm and brief. He said, "Caleb Whitaker," as though she didn't already know his name from 6 weeks of correspondence. Then he looked past her at the stagecoach, at the small face pressed against the window. "You didn't mention a child." "I mentioned reliability," Margaret said. "Clara doesn't interfere with my work. She never has." "This is a working cattle ranch, Mrs. Ellis." "It's not." "I know what a cattle ranch is, Mr. Whitaker. I cooked for the men who built the Kansas Pacific Railroad. I have managed stoves in conditions that would make your bunkhouse look like a hotel. I am telling you that my daughter doesn't interfere with my work because she never has, and I don't say things I'm not prepared to stand behind." The wind moved between them. One of the cowboys behind Caleb said something under his breath, and another one laughed. Caleb didn't turn around. He kept looking at her. "You didn't mention a child," he said again, and this time it wasn't an accusation. It was something quieter, something she couldn't quite read. "No," Margaret said. "I didn't, because I didn't want the advertisement to say no before it had a chance to say yes." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, something older than a smile. He said, "You told me you never failed to put a hot meal on the table." "I haven't. 16 men, hard work, long days." "You said that in the advertisement. The kitchen is not in good condition." "I'll manage." He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he looked down at her bags. Then he looked at the stagecoach where Clara's small face was still watching through the window with the patient, serious expression of a child who had learned to be still while adults made decisions about her life. "Take your bags inside," Caleb said. "The kitchen is in the back of the main house. Supper's expected at 6. You'll have about 4 hours." Margaret felt something unlock in her chest. Something she'd been holding shut for a very long time. She didn't let it show on her face. "4 hours is plenty," she said. She picked up her bags, went back to the stagecoach door and helped Clara down. Clara was small for 7, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's serious expression, and she looked at the ranch with the measured gaze of a child who had learned not to get attached too quickly. "It's okay, baby," Margaret said quietly. "We're here." Clara reached up and took her mother's hand. They walked toward the main house together. Behind them, Margaret heard one of the ranch hands say clearly enough that she was meant to hear it, 4 hours. She won't last 4 days. She kept walking. She had learned over 3 years of closed doors and cruel words and empty bank accounts, and watching her daughter grow up understanding that the world was not going to make things easy for them. She had learned that there was absolutely no point in turning around to argue with a man who had already decided what he thought. The only argument worth making was the one that happened inside that kitchen. She pushed the back door of the main house open and saw the kitchen for the first time, and took a slow breath. The stove was a wreck. One of the iron legs was propped up on a brick because something had broken and hadn't been repaired. The firebox door was loose and hung at a slight angle. The work surface along the wall was scarred and dirty. The storage area, she walked to it and opened the door and stood there for a moment taking inventory, was a disaster of disorganized bags, half-empty tins, jars with no labels, flour that had been stored improperly and gone to weevils in the bottom third of the sack. Clara stood behind her and said nothing. Margaret said, "All right." She said it to the kitchen and to herself and to whatever version of the future was waiting on the other side of this moment. "All right," she said again. "Let's find out what we have to work with." She spent the first 40 minutes of those 4 hours doing nothing but reorganize. She went through every supply on those shelves with the speed and focus of someone who had done this 100 times in worse conditions. She identified what was usable and what wasn't. She set aside what was ruined. She found behind a broken crate in the back corner a good-sized cache of dried beans that nobody had apparently thought to check on 2 sealed tins of tomatoes, a jar of dried herbs that still had smell to it, and enough salt pork to do something real with. Clara, without being asked, moved things from one shelf to another when her mother pointed. She was quiet and efficient, and had learned early how to be useful. The stove was the bigger problem. The loose firebox door meant the fire wouldn't draw right, which meant uneven heat, which meant bread that burned on one side and stayed raw on the other. Margaret knelt on the floor and looked at the hinge mechanism and thought about it for a moment. Then she looked around the kitchen until she found what she needed, a piece of heavy wire left over from something coiled near the back door. She used it to brace the door at the angle she needed. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. She got the fire started, and then she started cooking. She made biscuits first because biscuits were fast and filling, and because the smell of fresh bread baking was the most powerful tool any cook had. It changed the air in a place, it changed people's expectations. It told everyone within distance that something was different now, something was better. Pay attention. She made a pot of beef stew using the salt pork and the dried beans and the canned tomatoes and every bit of flavor she could pull from the dried herbs and the spices she'd found that still had life in them. She kept the fire managed. She tasted and adjusted. She talked Clara through what she was doing, not because the child was going to cook anytime soon, but because she believed in showing her daughter how problems got solved. "You start with what you have," she said, stirring the stew. "Not what you wish you had, what you have." "What if what you have isn't enough?" Clara asked. "Then you figure out how to make it enough," Margaret said. "That's the whole job. That's always the whole job." At 10 minutes before 6, she put the biscuits in the warming area, moved the stew to the right temperature, and started the coffee. At 6 o'clock exactly, she rang the dinner bell. She had found it hanging by the back door, tarnished and clearly not used recently. She rang it 3 times and then stood in the kitchen doorway and waited. She heard the boots on the porch before she saw the men. 16 of them coming in from the yard and the bunkhouse and the cattle pens, tired and dusty, and she watched their faces suspicious, expecting to be disappointed again. The way people look when they've been disappointed enough times that hope itself has started to feel like a kind of embarrassment. They stopped when the smell hit them. It was a particular thing to watch that moment when the smell of real food reaches people who haven't had real food in too long. The hardness in their faces shifted. They looked at each other. They looked at the pots on the stove. One of them, a big man, older, with a gray beard and kind eyes, pulled his hat off and held it against his chest like he was in church. "Lord," he said quietly, "that smells like something my mother used to make." "Sit down," Margaret said from the doorway. "All of you. It's ready." They sat. She served. She didn't wait to be thanked. She didn't hover watching for reactions. She served each man his plate the same way, enough food, good food, a biscuit on the side. And she kept moving. The silence in that room when they started eating was one of the most satisfying things she had heard in 3 years. The silence of men who were eating something worth being quiet for. The big man with the gray beard, she would learn his name, was Ethan Cole, and that he had been on this ranch 20 years. Ate half his plate before he set his fork down for a moment and said, "Ma'am." Margaret looked at him. "I ain't had food that tasted like something in about 8 months." He paused. "Thank you." She nodded. "Eat while it's hot." "Mr. Cole, Ethan Cole." "Mr. Cole, there's more in the pot." 3 men had seconds. 2 had thirds. The man who had laughed when she stepped off the stagecoach, she had taken careful note of his face, cleaned his plate, and said nothing. But he also didn't look at her with that same contempt. He looked at his plate. That was enough for now. Only one man didn't take a full portion. She noticed him at the end of the table. He was younger than the others, maybe 22, with a thin face and dark circles under his eyes that had nothing to do with a hard day's work. He had taken a small amount and eaten less than half of it. When the other men started clearing out, she brought the coffee pot to his end of the table and poured him a cup without asking. He looked up at her. "You feeling all right?" she asked. He looked startled, like he hadn't expected to be noticed. "I'm fine," he said. "Too quick. You didn't eat much." He stopped. He looked at the cup. "My stomach's been troubling me. A few days now." "What kind of trouble?" He looked uncertain. She waited. "Cramps," he said finally. "Like something twisting." She looked at him carefully, looked at the color of his skin, the tension around his eyes. She had cooked for railroad crews long enough to have learned more about men's ailments than most women were supposed to know. "Before your shift tomorrow morning," she said quietly, "come to the kitchen before anyone else is up. I'll make you something that'll help. Ginger and peppermint and some other things. It's not medicine, it's just what works." He stared at her. "My name's Henry," he said, like he needed to tell her something back. "Henry Park." "Mrs. Ellis," she said, "get some sleep, Henry." She started clearing the table. She was at the wash basin when she heard Caleb Whitaker's voice behind her. "Mrs. Ellis." She turned. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, hat in his hands, watching her with that same measuring expression from the yard. He had eaten with the men she had noticed, but she had not made anything of it. He had a quiet manner of making himself unremarkable when he wanted to. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "My men are fed," he said. "Yes, sir." "Better than they've been fed in months." She waited. "I want to be straight with you," Caleb said. He put his hat back on, which she had already noticed was what he did when he was being formal. "I've had 3 cooks in the past year. 2 of them left inside a month. One of them—" he paused. "One of them couldn't manage the crew." "I'm not here to manage your crew," Margaret said. "I'm here to feed them." "There's a difference." "Yes," she said. "Your crew's yours to manage. My kitchen is mine. As long as those 2 things stay separate, we'll be fine." He looked at her for a moment. "Frank Dawson," he said. "The man who was laughing when you arrived." "I know which man you mean. He's a problem. I've handled problems before. He's specifically going to be a problem for you." Margaret set down the cloth she was holding and looked at Caleb directly. "Mr. Whitaker, has Mr. Dawson done anything tonight that affected whether your men got fed on time?" Caleb thought about it. "No." "Then tonight he's not my problem. Tomorrow night we'll see." She picked up the cloth again. "Is there anything else you need before I put the kitchen to bed?" He stood there another moment. Then he said, "Your daughter, where's she sleeping?" It was the question she had been half afraid of all evening. "I can set up a corner in the kitchen," Margaret said carefully. "She's quiet. She won't be in anyone's way." "There's a room off the storage pantry," Caleb said. "It's small. It was for supplies. But there's a cot in there and there's a window." He paused. "She can have it. It's not much, but it's better than a kitchen corner." Margaret looked at him. She had expected a lot of things from this man. That was not one of them. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it in a way that went deeper than the words, in a way that she didn't let show on her face, because she had learned that showing gratitude too openly sometimes made certain people think you owed them something. Caleb nodded once. He turned to leave. At the doorway he stopped. "Mrs. Ellis," he said without turning around. "What you did today, the food, the coffee—" He seemed to be choosing his words the way a man picks his way across a rocky creek. "My men laughed at you this afternoon. I want you to know I didn't." She held on to the edge of the wash basin. "I know," she said. "I noticed." He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone. Then she went to the small room off the pantry where Clara was already asleep on the cot, with her coat folded under her head as a pillow. And she stood in the doorway watching her daughter sleep with the particular feeling of a woman who has just fought a battle she didn't know for certain she was going to win. She had arrived that morning with $42 and a dead husband's name. She had a kitchen now. She had a room for her daughter. She had 16 men who had eaten real food and been quiet while they ate it. And she had a feeling, not certainty, not yet, because she had learned too much about the world to confuse a good first day with safety, but a feeling quiet and persistent that this place was not going to be like all the other closed doors. This place might be something else entirely. She went to sleep that night with the smell of biscuits still on her hands, and the wind pushing against the window, and 16 pairs of boots still on the porch. It was, she thought, as close to hope as she'd allowed herself to get in 3 years. She decided to let herself have it, just for tonight. She would see about tomorrow when tomorrow came. Tomorrow morning came, the way Wyoming mornings always did, fast and cold and without apology. Margaret was already at the stove before the sun cleared the ridge. She had been up since 4:30, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she had learned years ago that the first person in the kitchen set the tone for the whole day, and she was not about to let anyone walk in and find that stove cold and that fire dead, and form an opinion about what kind of cook she was going to be. The fire was going. The coffee was on. She was working through a pan of cornbread when she heard the soft knock at the back door. Henry Park. She had half expected him not to come. Men had a particular kind of pride about admitting they needed help, especially to a woman they'd only just met, especially in front of a crew that was already watching everything she did. But there he was, thin-faced, dark circles, his hat in his hands the way men held their hats when they weren't sure of their welcome. "Come in," she said without turning around. "Close the door behind you. It's cold." He came in. He stood near the door like he wasn't sure how far into her kitchen he was allowed. She poured something into a tin cup from a small pot she'd had sitting at the back of the stove, ginger root she'd found in the spice shelf, dried peppermint, a little honey from a jar she'd unearthed during yesterday's reorganization, and she brought it to him and put it in his hands. "Drink it while it's hot," she said. "All of it." He looked at the cup. "What is it?" "Something that works," she said. "That's all you need to know." He drank it. She went back to her cornbread. The kitchen was quiet for a few minutes, just the fire and the wind outside, and the sound of him finishing the cup. Then he said, "Mrs. Ellis." The men were talking last night." He paused. "After supper." She kept working. "I imagine they were. Most of them." He stopped, seemed to be selecting his words carefully. "Most of them said the food was the best they'd had in months, maybe longer." "That's good to hear." "But Frank Dawson said—" Another pause. Longer this time. She turned around and looked at him directly. "What did Frank Dawson say, Henry?" Henry Park looked at the empty cup in his hands. "He said one good supper didn't prove anything. He said you'd fall apart inside a week. He said—" He swallowed. "He said Mr. Whitaker made a mistake, and that a woman built like you couldn't last a real Wyoming winter." The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret looked at the young man in front of her for a long moment. He was bracing himself. She could see it the way his shoulders had pulled up slightly, waiting for her reaction. Waiting for tears, maybe. Or anger. Or that particular flinching quality that some people had when the world reminded them of what it thought of them. She turned back to her cornbread. "Henry," she said. "Ma'am, how's your stomach feeling?" He blinked. He seemed to check. "Better, actually. A lot better." "Good," she said. "Go get your breakfast before the other men are up. There's biscuits from last night in the cloth on the second shelf. Take 2. You need to eat more than you have been." He stood there another moment. "Aren't you—" He stopped himself. "Aren't I what?" "Upset about what Frank said." Margaret slid the cornbread pan and didn't look up. "I've been hearing things like what Frank said since I was 16 years old, Henry. If I fell apart every time a man decided to tell the world what he thought of my size, I'd have run out of pieces a long time ago." She paused. The only thing Frank Dawson said last night that matters to me is the part where he called me a mistake. And the only way I know how to answer that is to still be here in 6 months cooking better food than he's ever had in his life. Now go eat your biscuits." Henry Park took his biscuits and left. She listened to his boots on the porch steps and the way they got quieter as he walked away. And she allowed herself one moment, just one of the specific, bone-deep exhaustion that came not from hard work, but from the constant weight of being underestimated. From carrying other people's small-mindedness on top of everything else you were already carrying. Then she let it go, because the cornbread needed watching and she had 15 more men to feed in 40 minutes. Breakfast was louder than supper had been. The men came in groups. Boots, heavy voices, low in the way of people who hadn't fully woken up yet, and they filled the long table with the particular organized chaos of a working crew that had a routine, even if that routine had recently consisted of disappointing food. The routine adjusted itself around the fact that the food was no longer disappointing. She watched it happen without making anything of it. Men who had yesterday been eyeing her with doubt now came through the kitchen door and went straight for the coffee pot with a kind of purposeful ease that told her they had already decided somewhere between waking up and walking over that this was going to be good, that they were going to get something worth getting up for. She kept the biscuits coming. She scrambled eggs in the big iron pan. She put out the cornbread in slices. Frank Dawson came in last. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild contempt, the way some faces do when a person has spent too many years deciding he was better than most things around him. He was maybe 40 years old, and he walked with the particular confidence of a man who had been the loudest voice in the room for so long he'd forgotten there was any other kind. He came through the door and looked at the table, and looked at the other men eating, and then looked at Margaret. She was already looking at him. She'd been expecting him since she heard his boots on the porch. "Mrs. Cook," he said, which was not her name, and he knew it. "Mr. Dawson," she said, calm, even, giving him nothing. He sat down at the table, and she brought him a plate the same as she'd brought everyone else. Same amount, same care. He looked at it. "Scrambled eggs," he said. "Yes, sir." "I like my eggs fried." She looked at him for exactly one beat. "I'll remember that for tomorrow," she said. "This morning, it's scrambled." Something moved through the table. Not quite silence, more like the specific quality of attention that a group of men gives a situation when they want to see how it plays out, but don't want to be caught watching. Frank looked at his plate. He looked at her. He picked up his fork. He ate. He didn't say it was good, but he ate every bite. That was its own kind of answer. The days that followed moved fast and established themselves quickly into a rhythm that Margaret understood was the most important thing she could create. Rhythm was trust. Rhythm was the thing that told 16 working men that they didn't have to worry about whether they'd be fed, which meant they could put all of their energy into the work instead of conserving it for disappointment. She was up before sunrise every morning. She had supper on the table at 6 every evening. She never varied by more than 5 minutes in either direction. In between, she learned the ranch. She learned it the way a good cook learns any operation, by paying attention to what the operation actually needed rather than what it said it needed. She watched the men come in from different tasks with different levels of exhaustion. She noticed that the fence crew worked harder on cold days and needed heavier food. She noticed that the men who worked with the cattle came in dehydrated and needed more to drink than they thought to ask for. She noticed that Thursday afternoons when Caleb went into town for the week's supplies, the mood on the ranch shifted in a subtle way. Men got louder, a little looser, the way people do when the authority figure is briefly absent, and she adjusted accordingly, making something slightly more indulgent on Thursday evenings, something that felt like a small celebration without anyone having to declare it one. Clara moved through the ranch the way quiet children move through adult spaces, carefully, observantly, taking up as little room as possible while absorbing everything. She helped in the kitchen before and after school. She had started at the Clearwater Schoolhouse, a 2-mile walk that Margaret walked with her every morning before coming back to start the midday preparations. The ranch hands adopted Clara the way working men adopt things that remind them of softness, carefully at first, then completely. Ethan Cole started saving her the best pieces of the apple that sometimes came in with the supply wagon. A young man named Pete Walsh, who was 20 years old and homesick in a way he'd never admit out loud, had started whittling small animals and leaving them on the kitchen windowsill for her. Margaret watched this and said nothing and filed it away in the part of her that was still learning whether this place was safe. It was the second week when the first real test came. It wasn't Frank Dawson. It wasn't anything she'd been watching for. It was the supply shipment. Caleb came back from town on a Thursday afternoon with a wagon that was carrying roughly 2/3 of what she'd put on the list. She went through it in the yard while he watched from the wagon seat, and she kept her face neutral while she counted what wasn't there. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "I know," he said. "The flour." "I know, Mrs. Ellis. I had 40 pounds of flour on that list, because 40 pounds is what I need to feed 16 men for 2 weeks, and there are only—" She lifted the sack. "22 pounds here. Millard's store in town was short," Caleb said. He climbed down from the wagon. He had the expression of a man who was already tired of the conversation he was about to have, which told her this was not a new problem. "He gets shipments from Denver, but the rail schedule's been unreliable. He's out of salt pork too, which I know is also on your list." Margaret looked at the supplies in the wagon. She ran through the arithmetic in her head, the kind of fast, necessary arithmetic that had nothing to do with schooling, and everything to do with having spent years making things stretch that weren't meant to stretch. "All right," she said. "I'll need to adjust the week's menu." "Can you manage?" She looked at him. "Can I manage on 22 pounds of flour and no salt pork for 16 men for 2 weeks?" "Yes." "No," she said plainly. "Not the same menu I had planned, but I can feed your men. They won't go hungry. It just won't be what I intended." He nodded slowly. He looked like he was about to say something and then didn't. "What?" she said. "Nothing. He paused. "The last cook. When this happened, she cried." Margaret picked up one of the supply bags. "Well," she said, "I'm not her." She went inside. What she managed that week, what she built out of 22 pounds of flour and creatively deployed dried goods and 2 chickens that had stopped laying and were therefore available for other purposes, was genuinely impressive, though she would never have described it that way herself. She described it when Ethan Cole asked her at supper on Wednesday night how she'd made something that tasted this good out of what he knew were limited supplies as cooking what you have instead of crying about what you don't. Ethan Cole laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that came up from somewhere genuine. "My mother used to say something like that," he told her. "Smart woman, your mother." She was. He was quiet for a moment. "She's been gone a long time now." Margaret looked at him. He was a big man. Ethan Cole big enough that his hands looked strange around a coffee cup. But there was something gentle in his face when he talked about his mother. Something that hadn't hardened over the way some things do. "She'd have liked you," he said. Margaret felt something move in her chest. She looked at her coffee cup. "That's a fine thing to say, Mr. Cole." "Ethan," he said. "After 2 weeks of the best food I've had since Kansas, I think you've earned the right to call me Ethan." She smiled, the real one, the one she didn't give out easily. It was the end of that same week when Frank Dawson finally decided to stop the low-level mockery and escalate to something more direct. She was in the kitchen on Friday afternoon an hour before supper when she heard his voice in the doorway. "Hey," he said, "not Mrs. Ellis, not ma'am, just hey, like she was something he was addressing rather than someone. She was working on the stew. She didn't turn around. "Mr. Dawson, I need to talk to you about something." "I'm listening." He came into the kitchen. She heard his boots on the floor, deliberate, heavy, the sound of a man who wanted his footsteps heard. He stopped somewhere behind her and slightly to her left, which she recognized as a positioning choice. Close enough to be imposing. Far enough to claim innocence if she objected. "The men have been talking," he said. "Men do that. They're saying you're getting too comfortable, getting too—" He paused, seeming to select the word. "Familiar." She put her spoon down. She turned around. He was watching her with that expression she'd been reading for 2 weeks, the one that was looking for a crack, a flinch, anything she'd given him that he could use to say he'd been right about her from the start. "Too familiar," she said. "With Mr. Whitaker," Frank said. "The men are noticing." She looked at him steadily. "What exactly are the men noticing, Mr. Dawson? The way he talks to you. The way he gestured vaguely. "A cook doesn't need to be having long conversations with the man who owns the ranch. That's not how it works." "How does it work?" she asked. He shifted. Something in her calm seemed to unsettle him. She had noticed that about Frank Dawson. He expected agitation. He expected her to get flustered or defensive or emotional, and when she didn't, it knocked him slightly off his footing. A cook does their job and stays in the kitchen. "I see," Margaret said. "And is your food on the table at 6 o'clock every evening?" "That's not—" "Is it?" He stopped. "Is your coffee hot in the morning?" she continued. "Are your biscuits fresh? Did you or did you not eat 3 portions of the beef stew on Monday night, Mr. Dawson, which I noticed because I kept having to refill the pot?" His jaw tightened. "I am in this kitchen from before sunrise to after sunset," Margaret said. "I cook for 16 men without complaint. I have kept this operation running through a supply shortage without any of your crew going hungry. What I discuss with Mr. Whitaker in the course of doing my job is my business, and his, and it is none of yours." She picked up her spoon again. "Your supper will be on the table at 6. I suggest you be there to eat it." Frank Dawson stood in her kitchen for another 3 seconds. Then he left. She turned back to her stew. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. She had learned years ago that the only thing more important than not showing fear was genuinely not feeling it, or at least knowing how to put it somewhere it couldn't reach you while you were still in the room. Frank Dawson was the kind of man who fed on other people's uncertainty the way fire fed on dry wood. The moment she'd let him see her shake, the moment she'd given him anything that looked like doubt, it would never stop. She had met 100 Frank Dawsons. She had outlasted every single one of them. But she wasn't foolish enough to think the conversation in the kitchen was the end of it. That evening after supper, she found Caleb in the yard, checking on something with one of the fence posts near the main gate. She didn't usually seek him out. She had kept their interactions professional and purposeful. She asked about supplies, about the crew's schedule, about anything that affected how she managed the kitchen. She didn't linger, but she walked out to the fence post and waited until he looked up. "Frank Dawson came to see me today," she said. Caleb straightened. "What did he say?" She told him, all of it plainly without editorializing. Caleb's face went through something while she talked. She watched him go from careful to still to something quieter and more controlled, that she was starting to recognize as the expression he had when he was genuinely angry, but had long since decided not to perform anger in front of his crew. When she finished, he said, "I'll talk to him." "I handled it," she said. "I'm not telling you because I need you to fight my battles, Mr. Whitaker. I'm telling you because you own this ranch, and you should know what's happening on it." He looked at her. "You handled it." "Yes. And you came to tell me anyway." "I run a kitchen," she said. "Not a secret organization." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the structure of one. "What did you say to him?" Caleb asked. "I asked him if his food was on the table at 6. He didn't have an answer." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Frank's been on this ranch for 6 years," he said. He wasn't defending the man, she could hear the difference. He was explaining something. "He ran the crew for about a year before I got the operation stable enough to take it back myself. He's never entirely accepted that the running of things isn't his job anymore." "That explains him," Margaret said. It doesn't change anything. No. Caleb agreed. It doesn't. He looked at the fence post, looked back at her. Mrs. Ellis. He stopped. Mr. Whitaker. I want you to know that what Frank implied about the way I talked to you about there being anything. He seemed to hit a wall in the sentence. He tried again. I want to make sure you know that your position here is, Mr. Whitaker, she said. I have been a widow for 3 years. I have supported myself and my daughter alone for 3 years. I am not confused about the nature of my employment, and I am not in the habit of misreading professional courtesy as anything other than what it is. She looked at him directly. Is there something about the way I've conducted myself that has given you reason to be concerned? No, he said immediately. No, not at all. I only wanted... Then we're fine, she said. I just thought you should know about Frank. Good night, Mr. Whitaker. She walked back to the house. She heard him say quietly to the fence post, or to the night, or possibly to her retreating back. Good night, Mrs. Ellis. She didn't let herself think about the specific quality of the way he said it until she was inside with the door closed. Then she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the work surface. The thing about Caleb Whitaker, the thing she had been carefully, deliberately not examining too closely, was that he was nothing like what she had expected. She had expected a practical man. Someone who ran numbers and managed livestock and made hard decisions without sentiment. She had gotten that. What she hadn't expected was the way he listened. Not with the half-present attention of a man waiting for his turn to talk, but with the full, focused attention of someone who had decided that what you were saying was worth understanding. She hadn't expected the quiet way he had given Clara a room without being asked. She hadn't expected the expression on his face that Thursday when he'd told her about the supply shortage, that brief, uncomfortable look that told her he was ashamed of falling short, that he genuinely cared whether his cook had what she needed to do her job well. She hadn't expected him to be the kind of man who noticed things. She pushed herself away from the work surface. She had a daughter to check on and a kitchen to put to bed. She was not here to notice what kind of man Caleb Whitaker was. She was here to cook. She told herself that with some firmness and went to check on Clara. Clara was at the small table in her room, writing something in the composition book she'd carried all the way from Dodge City, her drawings mostly the careful and serious drawings of a child who had decided early that art was a safe way to say things she wasn't sure how to say out loud. "What are you drawing?" Margaret asked. Clara turned the book so her mother could see. It was the ranch. The yard, the bunkhouse, the fence line rendered in the simplified, confident lines of a child who drew what she saw rather than what she thought she was supposed to see. And in the middle of it, 2 small figures. A woman drawn large and round and solid, and a little girl standing close beside her. Margaret looked at the drawing for a long moment. "You like it here," she said. It wasn't really a question. Clara considered it with the seriousness she gave most things. "I like it more than Kansas," she said. "The men here aren't mean to you." Margaret sat on the edge of the cot. "Most of them aren't." "The tall one with the gray beard," Clara said. "He called me Miss Clara today." "That's Ethan." "He's nice." Clara looked at her drawing. "Is the other man going to be a problem? The loud one?" Margaret looked at her daughter. Sometimes she forgot in the ordinary dailiness of managing everything that Clara was watching all of it. That Clara was 7 years old and had already developed an accurate read on human nature from 3 years of following her mother through closed doors and difficult situations. "He might try to be," Margaret said carefully. "But you're not scared of him." "No, baby, I'm not." Clara turned back to her drawing with the satisfied air of someone who has received the answer they expected. "Good," she said. "Because the tall man with the gray beard said you were the best cook this ranch ever had. And he said it loud enough that the loud man could hear." Margaret stared at her daughter. "When did Ethan Cole say that?" "At supper," Clara said. "When the loud man started saying something under his breath. Mr. Cole just said it louder, like he was talking to the whole room." She added a fence post to her drawing. "The other men laughed. The loud man stopped talking. Margaret sat with that for a moment. Ethan Cole, 20 years on this ranch. The man who had said her food smelled like his mother's cooking, standing up in a room full of men and making sure his voice was louder than Frank Dawson's. She felt something move in her chest, the same thing that had moved when Caleb gave Clara a room when Henry Park came to the kitchen door at 5 in the morning and trusted her to help him without anyone seeing. This place was doing something she hadn't planned for. It was starting to feel like somewhere she mattered. She was very careful about that feeling. She had been careful about it before in other places and been wrong. She had learned that belonging wasn't a thing a place offered you. It was a thing you built slowly out of 1,000 small moments, and you didn't know if it was real until it had been tested. She kissed Clara's hair. "Get some sleep," she said. "I need you up by 7. She went to bed that night with Frank Dawson's contempt, and Caleb Whitaker's careful courtesy, and Ethan Cole's loyalty, and her daughter's drawing all sitting somewhere in the back of her mind, like pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand the shape of. The ranch was not home yet, but it was becoming something. And 3 weeks in, with winter already starting to talk about arriving in the way Wyoming winters did, loudly and without warning, Margaret Ellis allowed herself to believe quietly, and without saying it to anyone, that she was not going to be sent away from this place. She had survived worse than Frank Dawson. She had survived worse than Wyoming, and she was just beginning to understand what she was capable of building here if they would let her. The question, the one she didn't ask out loud not yet, was whether they were beginning to understand it too. The storm didn't announce itself the way storms were supposed to. It came in sideways on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into November, and by the time Margaret had rung the breakfast bell and the first men were pulling on their coats, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the sky had gone the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming. Ethan Cole came into the kitchen before the others and stood near the stove with his coffee and looked out the small window and said, "That's a bad one coming." "How bad?" Margaret asked. "Bad enough that Caleb's going to want to get the cattle moved before it hits." He drank his coffee. "He rode out an hour ago to check the north pasture. Said he'd be back by noon." "And if the storm comes before noon?" Ethan looked at her. "Then he ain't back by noon." She registered that without showing it on her face. She served breakfast. She watched the men eat faster than usual, with the focused efficiency of people who understood that weather in Wyoming was not a suggestion, it was a directive, and you either moved with it or it moved you. They were gone by 6:30, all of them, out into a morning that was already becoming something else. Clara came into the kitchen at 7 and looked at the window and said, "It's getting dark again." "Eat your breakfast," Margaret said. "I'm going to walk you to school and then come straight back." "Is it going to snow?" "Probably." "A lot." Margaret looked at her daughter. She looked at the sky through the window. "Yes," she said. "I think a lot." She walked Clara to school in a wind that was already mean enough to make conversation difficult. She kissed her daughter's forehead at the schoolhouse door and told her that if the weather got bad during the day, the school teacher would keep the children inside and that she should stay put and not try to walk home on her own. Clara gave her the look she had, the 7-year-old look that meant, "I am not a fool, Mama. I know how weather works," and went inside. Margaret walked back to the ranch in a wind that was getting worse by the minute. By 10 o'clock, the snow was coming down in a way that meant business. By 11, the yard had disappeared under 6 inches, and the visibility from the kitchen window had dropped to the length of the porch. She kept the stove burning. She kept the coffee on. She started a soup because soup was what you made when a storm was coming. Something that could sit and wait and be ready the moment someone needed it. Something warm you could put in a man's hands the second he came through the door. At 11:40, she heard shouting from somewhere she couldn't see. She was at the back door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The voice was Pete Walsh's. She knew his voice by now, the slight upward lilt at the end of his sentences, the way he always sounded slightly younger than he was. She heard it cutting through the wind, and then she heard something underneath it that made her stomach drop. She went out into the snow. She found them 20 yards from the barn. Pete and 2 other men she could barely see through the white, and between them, a 4th figure who was not standing on his own. The fourth figure was Danny Reyes, one of the younger hands, 20 years old, with a wide smile and a habit of pushing himself past what was sensible. He was not smiling now. He was being held up by Pete on one side and a man named Cal Briggs on the other, and his left leg was hanging at an angle that told Margaret everything she needed to know before anyone said a single word. "What happened?" she said loud enough to carry over the wind. "His horse spooked," Pete said. He was pale under his hat brim. "Threw him against the fence post. His leg, Mrs. Ellis, his leg is—" "I can see what his leg is," she said. "Bring him inside. Slowly. Don't let that leg drag." "Shouldn't we? Isn't there a doctor in town, yes?" she said. 5 miles away in a blizzard." She looked at Pete directly. "Bring him inside. Now. I'll tell you what to do." She didn't wait for his answer. She went back inside ahead of them and started moving. She had the kitchen table cleared before they got through the door. She had her hands washed and her sleeves rolled up. She had located from the supply pantry the clean cloth she'd set aside weeks ago when she'd first taken inventory and found it and thought, "I don't know what I'll need this for, but I'll need it for something." They got Danny Reyes onto the table. He was conscious, barely drifting in and out of the particular shocked state that the body produces when it's been badly hurt and hasn't finished deciding how to respond. His face was white. He was shaking. He made a sound when they moved his leg that Margaret had heard before and did not like to hear. "Danny," she said. He opened his eyes. "Look at me. Right here. Look at my face." He looked at her. "You're going to be all right," she said. "I need you to stay awake. Can you do that for me?" "It hurts," he said. The words were slurred at the edges. "I know it does. Stay awake. Keep looking at me." She turned to Pete without shifting her voice. Same calm, same steady authority, the same tone that said, "I have this situation, and you will not panic. Go to the supply room. Top shelf left side. There's a brown bottle. Bring it now." Pete went. She examined the leg. She had learned enough in 3 years of cooking for railroad crews men who worked with their bodies in ways that routinely produced injuries to know the difference between a break that would kill a man and a break that would sideline him. This was the second kind. The bone was wrong, clearly wrong, but the skin was intact and the circulation below the injury felt. She checked it, pressing carefully at his ankle present. She was not a doctor. She was also the only person in this building who was going to do anything useful in the next 20 minutes. Pete came back with the bottle. She measured a dose that would take the edge off the pain without putting Danny fully under. She needed him conscious enough to tell her if something felt worse when she stabilized the leg. "This is going to taste bad," she told Danny. "Drink it anyway." He drank it. She looked at Pete and Cal Briggs and the third man, whose name was Jesse. All three of them standing in her kitchen watching her with the wide-eyed attention of people who had just realized that the woman they worked alongside was not who they'd thought she was. "I need 2 straight pieces of wood," she said. "Smooth about this long." She showed them with her hands. "And more of that cloth from the pantry. And someone needs to keep that fire going because when I'm done with his leg, we need this room to stay warm." They moved, all 3 of them immediately without argument. She hadn't raised her voice once. What followed was 40 minutes of careful, focused work that Margaret did not allow herself to feel the full weight of until it was over. She stabilized the leg. She talked to Danny the entire time, not about what she was doing, but about other things. Small things. Things that gave him somewhere to put his attention, that wasn't the pain. She asked him where he was from. She asked about his family. She asked if he had a girl somewhere, and he said yes, a girl in Colorado named Rosa, and she said, "Tell me about Rosa." And he did, halting and pale and shaking, but talking. When it was done, and Danny was as stable as she could make him, and the improvised splint was set, and the pain had begun to recede to a manageable level, she looked up from the table for the first time in 40 minutes. Pete Walsh was standing 2 feet away, watching her with an expression she didn't have a word for. "Mrs. Ellis," he said. "He needs to stay still," she said. The doctor needs to come out from town as soon as the storm lets up. Someone needs to ride the moment it's safe. Not before I don't need another man hurt, but the moment it's safe." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. He hadn't moved. "Pete." "Yes, ma'am." "He's going to be all right." Pete Walsh, who was 20 years old and had been homesick since August and had left a mother and 2 sisters back in Missouri, let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "Thank you," he said. His voice was unsteady in a way he clearly didn't want it to be. She looked at him with the specific understanding of a woman who had watched young men try to hold themselves together and knew what it cost them. "Go get yourself some coffee," she said. "You did right bringing him in fast." He went. She stood at the table and looked at Danny Reyes, who had finally mercifully drifted into sleep. Then she looked at the kitchen she had built in 6 weeks, out of a disaster of a stove and disorganized supplies, and the skepticism of 16 men who'd expected her to fail. She had not failed. The storm was still coming down outside. The wind was loud against the walls. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear cattle. And Caleb Whitaker had not come back. That was the thought she'd been managing carefully for the last 40 minutes, keeping it in the back of her mind where it couldn't reach the part of her that needed to be clear and useful and steady. But now that she had a moment, now that Danny was stable and the men were accounted for, and the immediate crisis had a shape she could manage, she let herself think it plainly. Caleb had gone out at 5 in the morning to check the north pasture. It was now 12:30. The storm had been serious since 11. He hadn't come back. She went to find Ethan Cole. She found him in the doorway of the bunkhouse, looking out at the wall of white, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not in 6 weeks of daily company, not through the supply shortage, not through Frank Dawson's troublemaking. It was the expression of a man who was genuinely worried. "He knows this land," Ethan said before she'd gotten to him. "He's been on this ranch for 12 years. He knows how to read a storm." "I know," she said. "He's not... Caleb doesn't do foolish things." He seemed to be saying it as much to himself as to her. He would have found shelter. The Hendersons' place is about 2 miles north of the pasture. If he couldn't make it back, he'd go there. "Then that's probably where he is," Margaret said. "Probably," Ethan said. They stood there for a moment with the storm between them, and that word probably doing exactly as much and as little work as it was able to. "Danny Reyes is stable," she said. "He's sleeping. I need someone to sit with him. Just watch him, make sure he stays still. Come get me if anything changes." Ethan nodded. He pushed himself off the doorframe. "I'll do it." He looked at her. "How'd you know what to do for the leg?" "Railroad crews," she said. "You see enough injuries, you learn." He nodded again slowly, like he was adding this to a collection of things he knew about her that he was still in the process of understanding. "Mrs. Ellis," he said. "Ethan?" "I'm glad you're here." He said it plainly, without decoration. The way a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean says something he means. She had no response that felt adequate to that, so she said, "Go sit with Danny. I'll bring you coffee." She went back to her kitchen. She kept the soup going. She managed the fire. She checked on Danny every 30 minutes. She made sure every man on the ranch had a hot meal at what would have been the midday hour, a little late, but present. Because the worst thing she could do right now was let the structure of the day dissolve. Let the storm make everything formless and frightened. She kept the rhythm going because the rhythm was the thing that told everyone they were going to be okay. Caleb came back at 2 in the afternoon. She heard the horse first, and then boots on the porch, and then the back door opened, and he was there, snow-covered, and cold-stiffened, and clearly exhausted, but upright present, with both hands, and all the usual number of pieces. She looked at him from across the kitchen. He looked at her. "I sheltered at the Hendersons," he said. "Storm closed in faster than I expected. I came as soon as I could see the road." "I know," she said. "Ethan said that's where you'd be." "Is everyone—" He stopped. He read something in her face. What happened? She told him about Danny, all of it. quickly without softening it, because Caleb Whitaker was the kind of man who needed the real version rather than the managed version. When she finished, he stood very still. "Is he going to be all right?" he said. "Yes. He needs a doctor to look at it properly, but yes. The bone is broken, not shattered. He'll be off the leg for 6 to 8 weeks. She paused. "He needs to stay still, and he needs to stay warm, and he needs someone to ride to town for the doctor the moment it's safe." Caleb nodded. He hadn't taken his coat off yet. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. He looked at her. "The doctor," she said. "Don't send anyone until the storm genuinely lets up. I mean that. I am not interested in managing 2 injuries in one day." "No," he said. "No, I know. I won't." He stood there another moment. He looked like a man who had just arrived back from somewhere difficult and found things both worse and better than he'd feared. "You stabilized him." "I did what I could." "You stabilized him," he said again. He wasn't questioning it. He was doing something else with the words, processing maybe. Understanding something. She started toward the stove to check the soup, and he said, "Margaret." She stopped. He had not called her by her given name before. In 6 weeks of daily contact in 24 conversations across kitchen doorways and supply lists and the yard and the fence post in the evening, he had always been Mr. Whitaker, and she had always been Mrs. Ellis, and that had been correct and appropriate, and she had not expected anything different. The silence had a particular quality to it that she didn't look at too carefully. "The men," Caleb said. "They're all right. All of them. All of them," she said. "Accounted for. Fed. Inside." He let out a breath. "Mrs. Ellis," he said. Back to that. Whatever had slipped through a moment ago had been pulled back into order. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, matching him. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and went back to the stove. She heard him cross the kitchen and go into the main part of the house. She heard him stop in the doorway, and then she heard the quality of his silence when he saw Danny Reyes laid out on the table in the good lamplight stable and sleeping with Ethan Cole, sitting beside him, reading the same page of the same book he'd been trying to read for 2 hours. She heard Ethan say something she couldn't quite catch. She heard Caleb say very quietly, "I'll be damned." She kept stirring the soup. The storm broke by evening. The doctor came the next morning, rode out from Clearwater in the cold, clear aftermath, looked at Danny's leg, and looked at the stabilization, and looked at Margaret standing in the kitchen doorway and said, "Who did this?" "I did," she said. He was a compact man in his 50s named Dr. Aldridge, with sharp eyes and no particular sentiment about surprises. He looked at her for a moment. "Railroad medicine. Railroad experience," she said. "I'm a cook." "You're not just a cook," he said. He turned back to Danny. "You set this well. Better than well. You may have kept him from permanent damage to that leg." She held on to that after he left. She didn't let it show on her face, but she held it. That evening, something shifted in the bunkhouse. She didn't hear exactly what was said. She wasn't present for it, and she didn't ask. But she could feel the change the way you felt weather changing, in the way the air of a place became different, in the way people moved and talked and looked at her when she came in with the supper pots. Pete Walsh held the kitchen door open for her and took the heavy pot from her hands without being asked. Cal Briggs, who had barely spoken to her in 6 weeks, said, "Evening, Mrs. Ellis," with the careful courtesy of a man who was working at something. Even Quiet Jessie, who seemed to communicate primarily through nods, pulled out her chair when she moved to set something down near the end of the table. Frank Dawson sat at his end of the table and said nothing. But he said nothing differently than before. The contempt that had always been present in his silence was not gone exactly. Changed, compressed into something smaller. Something that had to share space with other things now. She noticed. She didn't remark on it. She served supper and went back to the kitchen. It was 3 days after the storm, with Danny healing steadily and the ranch getting back to its rhythm and the cold having settled into a permanent, serious presence that meant winter had fully arrived when the second thing happened. The thing that changed everything. She was reorganizing the storage room, A job she'd been meaning to get to for weeks, the kind of deep order reorganization that a kitchen needed every season if the supplies were going to be managed well. She was working through the back shelves, the ones behind where the extra crates were stacked, pulling things forward and checking dates and making her list of what needed to be ordered when her hand found something that wasn't a supply tin. It was a wooden box, not large, about the size of a bread loaf, darker than the shelves pushed so far to the back that it had clearly been sitting there undisturbed for a very long time. There was dust on the lid in the particular layered way of something that hadn't been touched in years. She pulled it forward. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. Inside, under a piece of oilcloth that had gone stiff with age, were papers. Folded documents written in the kind of formal legal language that belonged to contracts and agreements with dates and signatures and the particular weight of official record. She unfolded the top one carefully. It was brittle at the edges but intact. She started reading. She read it once. Then she read it again more slowly, because what she was reading didn't immediately make sense in the context of anything she thought she knew about this ranch. Then she sat on the floor of the storage room, just sat down right there, which she would never normally do, and read it a third time. It was a land survey and boundary agreement, dated 1878, signed by 3 parties. One of them was Caleb Whitaker's father, and what it established clearly legally in language that even she could parse without being a lawyer was that the eastern boundary of the Whitaker land extended considerably further than the boundary currently being claimed and contested. She had heard Caleb mention a name once, Harold Pierce, in a conversation with Ethan she hadn't been meant to overhear. She had filed it away as none of her business. A land dispute between neighboring ranchers was not something a cook needed to understand, except she had also heard 2 weeks ago Pete Walsh telling Cal Briggs in the yard that Pierce's men had been moving the survey markers on the eastern fence line, inch by inch, month by month, trying to claim 50 acres of Whitaker grazing land by relocating the physical markers that marked the boundary. She looked at the document in her hands. She looked at the date. She looked at the signature. She got up off the floor. She found Caleb in his barn, where he'd been working since morning, on something with one of the horse stalls. She walked in with the document in her hands and the box under her arm, and she said, "Mr. Whitaker, I need you to stop what you're doing and look at something." He turned. He saw her face. She couldn't entirely control what was on her face in that moment, and he put down his tools immediately. "What is it?" She held out the document. He took it. He started reading. She watched his face. She watched it go through several things in rapid succession. Confusion, then concentration, then something she could only describe as slow dawn. The expression of a man who is understanding something that has been kept from him for a long time. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Storage room, back shelf. Behind the crates nobody ever moves." She set the box down on the hay bale beside her. "There are 3 more documents in there. I only read the first one, but they look like they're connected." He read the other 3 documents right there in the barn. She stood and waited. She didn't speak. When he finished, he stood with the papers in his hands, and he looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. His jaw was set. His hands were very still. "Pierce has been claiming this boundary for 2 years, he said. "He brought in his own survey, his own man. Told me the original markers were placed wrong." He stopped. "My father signed this agreement in 1878. I was 6 years old. I didn't even know it existed." "It was in a box in the back of your storage room," she said. "Under oilcloth. I don't think anyone had looked for it. I don't think anyone knew it was there." "My father wasn't." Caleb stopped himself. Started again. "My father wasn't organized. He kept things wherever they were when he stopped moving. I've been going on his verbal accounts of the boundaries and a survey map that Pierce's man told me was the authoritative one." He looked at her. "This contradicts his survey entirely." "Yes," she said, "by what looks like a significant amount. I'm not a lawyer." "But that," she pointed at the first document, "that looks like exactly the kind of thing a lawyer would want to see." Caleb looked at the papers again. "You went into the storage room to reorganize supplies?" he said slowly. Yes. And you found this? Yes. He looked at her, the same measuring look from the first day, but different now. Loaded with something it hadn't carried on that first day. Mrs. Ellis, he said. Yes. Do you have any idea what this means? I think it means Harold Pierce has been stealing from you, she said. Slowly, officially, with paperwork. She paused. I think it means you can stop him. Something moved through his face. It was not relief, not exactly. It was something bigger than relief and quieter. Like a man who has been carrying a weight for so long he's forgotten it was there, and someone has just pointed at it and said, "You don't have to carry that." How did you know to read it? He said. Most people would have put it back. Not their business. I didn't know what it was until I started reading it, she said. And by the time I knew what it was, I'd already read enough to know I couldn't put it back. He looked at her for a long, specific moment. You saved my ranch tonight, he said. You understand that? She looked at him steadily. I found a document in a storage room, she said. Don't give me more credit than I've earned. You saved my ranch, he said again, like he hadn't heard her, like he was talking to himself as much as to her. You stabilized Danny Reyes, and you kept 16 men fed and calm through a blizzard, and you just found the one piece of paper that Pierce's lawyer has been making sure I'd never know existed. He stopped. His voice had gone somewhere quieter. You've been here 6 weeks. 7, she said. He looked at her. The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind was doing what Wyoming wind did in November, pushing against everything. Patient and relentless, indifferent to anything that stood in its way. Inside, something else was happening, something that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet, or perhaps the courage. And so it sat between them in the good silence of the barn, with the horses moving in their stalls, and the lamplight making everything warm. I need to go to town, Caleb said finally. First thing in the morning. The lawyer there, Mitchell, he needs to see this. Yes, she said. You'll be all right here, with the crew. She looked at him with a specific expression that she didn't bother softening. Mr. Whitaker, I was all right here when you were stuck in a blizzard and Danny Reyes had a broken leg. The corner of his mouth moved. Yes, he said. You were. He rode to town the next morning with the documents in his coat pocket and came back in the late afternoon with a look on his face that she read from 50 yards away. Purposeful. Charged, the look of a man who has handed a problem to someone who knows what to do with it. Mitchell says it's solid, Caleb told her in the kitchen that evening. The agreement holds. Pierce's survey is worthless in the face of it. His lawyer knows it. Mitchell says Pierce will try to challenge it, but he won't win. He paused. He says if we'd let another year go by without finding this, Pierce might have established enough physical precedent with the moved markers to make it difficult. Margaret set his coffee down in front of him. Then it's good we found it when we did, she said. Caleb wrapped his hands around the cup. He looked at the table. Then he looked up at her with something in his eyes that he didn't try to conceal, which was itself unusual enough that she noticed it. Margaret, he said. She didn't correct him this time. Why are you here? He said. She looked at him. I know why you came, he said. I know about the advertisement and Kansas and the railroad and your husband. That's not what I'm asking. He seemed to be working toward something. I'm asking why, of all the places you could have landed, why a struggling mountain ranch in Wyoming? He paused. Why us? She was quiet for a moment. Because you were the only one who wrote back, she said. He held that for a moment. And if 2 people had written back, he said. She looked at him, looked at the hands around the coffee cup, looked at the face that had become over 7 weeks, the face she'd gotten used to seeing across the doorway and the yard and the fence line at the end of the day. I don't know, she said honestly. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she could give him. He nodded slowly. Like it was enough for now. Like he understood that some things were being built in real time and that you couldn't rush the building without weakening what you were building. Your biscuits, he said. The ones from this morning. She waited. "They were the best thing I've eaten in 12 years, he said. "And I want you to know I'm not saying that because you found a document in my storage room." She looked at him for a moment, then she laughed. It wasn't the polite sound she'd been deploying for 6 weeks, not the controlled professional acknowledgement of a pleasant remark. It was a real laugh, the kind she hadn't given away to anyone in longer than she wanted to think about the kind that came up from somewhere unguarded. Caleb Whitaker looked at her laugh like a man seeing something he hadn't known he was looking for. She pulled herself back, picked up a cloth, moved back toward the stove. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker," she said. He was still at the table when she went to check on Clara. She told herself firmly and deliberately that she was not going to think about the way he'd looked at her laugh. She thought about it anyway. She thought about it until she fell asleep, and then she dreamed something she didn't remember in the morning, but woke up from with the particular feeling of a woman who has gotten closer to something important without meaning to. The ranch was dark and quiet around her. The storm was gone, and in the storage room off the kitchen, the empty wooden box sat on the back shelf like a promise that had been kept years before anyone knew it needed keeping. Harold Pierce came to the ranch on a Thursday. He didn't send word ahead. He didn't ask permission. He simply arrived at the gate the way men like Harold Pierce arrived everywhere, like the space already belonged to them and everyone else was there on borrowed time. Margaret heard the horses from the kitchen. 2 of them. She looked out and saw a man she didn't recognize on a large bay gelding, and behind him a younger man who had the particular posture of someone hired to look intimidating. The man in front was well-dressed for ranch country, too well-dressed, the kind of careful presentation that told you he wanted people to remember that he had money and that the money mattered. She kept her hands moving. She was in the middle of bread dough, and she did not stop. Caleb was in the yard. She heard the exchange of voices, not the words, just the tone, and the tone was wrong from the first sentence. She could read the shape of a conversation the way she could read the shape of a storm, and what she heard through that kitchen window was not courtesy. It was challenge dressed up in courtesy's clothes. Ethan Cole came through the kitchen door 2 minutes later. He looked at her. "Pierce is here." "I know," she said. She kept working the dough. "He's telling Caleb that the document you found is a forgery." Her hand stopped. She looked at Ethan. "A forgery," she said. "That's what he's saying. He's got a man with him, not the young one outside. Another man from town, apparently, who Pierce is claiming is some kind of document expert. Says the paper and the ink don't match the period. Says Caleb's father never signed it." Ethan's jaw was tight. "He's saying Caleb planted it." The silence in the kitchen had a specific quality. Margaret looked down at the dough under her hands. She thought about the box, the dust on the lid, the oilcloth gone stiff with years, the brittle edges of the paper that had tried to fold back on itself along creases that had been set for at least a decade. She thought about Harold Pierce riding onto this property with a document expert and an accusation on a Thursday without sending word ahead. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Where are they?" she said. Ethan looked at her carefully. "Yard. Caleb's trying to keep it calm." "Is he managing?" A pause. "Not entirely." She went outside. Pierce was still on his horse, which was itself a choice. Staying mounted while Caleb stood on the ground was the kind of petty power move that a certain kind of man made automatically, without even thinking about it, the way breathing was automatic. He was somewhere around 50, with a broad, well-fed face and the specific confidence of someone who had won enough arguments that he'd stopped expecting to lose. The man beside him on the ground, the supposed document expert, was younger, thin, with ink-stained fingers and the uncomfortable expression of someone who'd been paid to say something he wasn't entirely sure was true. Caleb was standing 10 feet from Pierce's horse with his arms crossed and a look on his face that Margaret had not seen before. She had seen Caleb Whitaker in a blizzard. She had seen him managing a cattle crisis. She had seen him tired and worried and grateful and quietly moved. She had not seen him cornered, and what she was looking at now was a man who understood he was being cornered and was trying to hold himself together in the face of it. Pierce noticed her before she'd gotten halfway across the yard. He looked at her the way certain men looked at women who appeared where they hadn't been expected, with a mixture of dismissal and mild irritation at having to register their existence at all. "Who is this?" he said to Caleb. "My cook," Caleb said. He said it in a tone that meant something more than the words. Pierce looked at Margaret with a perfunctory up and down that catalogued her in about 3 seconds. Her size, her apron, her flour-dusted hands, and then looked back at Caleb with the expression of a man who had saying, "Whitaker, your lawyer can take that document to whatever judge he likes. My man here has examined comparable materials from the 1870s, and he's prepared to testify that the paper stock and the ink composition are—" "Mr. Pierce," Margaret said. Pierce stopped. Slowly, with the deliberateness of someone making a point about interruption, he looked at her. "My cook has something to add," he said. She looked at him steadily. She had spent 2 months building a steadiness that Frank Dawson and the Wyoming winter and Danny Reyes's broken leg and a blizzard hadn't cracked, and she was not about to let it crack now for a man on a horse. "I found that document," she said. "I'd like to ask your expert a question." Pierce's expression shifted into something that was almost amused. "By all means," he said with the particular generosity of a man who was absolutely certain he was going to win. She looked at the thin man with the ink-stained fingers. He looked back at her with the uncomfortable expression that had intensified since she'd started talking. "You examined the paper," she said. "I did," he said. "Where did you examine it?" He blinked. "I at my office, in town. Mr. Pierce brought it to me." "Mr. Pierce brought it to you," she said. "So you examined a copy, or a document that Pierce removed from Caleb's lawyer's possession." The thin man's mouth opened. Nothing came out immediately. "Which was it?" she said. Mr. Mitchell allowed." Mitchell allowed Pierce's hired man to examine the original document. She looked at Caleb, then back at the thin man. "Or did Pierce obtain a copy through some other means and bring you a reproduction to assess?" Pierce's voice had lost its amusement. "This is not—" "I'm asking him," Margaret said. She didn't look at Pierce. She kept her eyes on the thin man who was looking more uncomfortable by the second. "Sir, I'm asking you directly. Did you examine the original document held in Mr. Mitchell's office under controlled conditions? Or did Mr. Pierce bring you something and ask you to assess it?" The thin man looked at Pierce. That look was its own answer. Margaret looked at Caleb. Caleb was watching the thin man with the expression of someone whose understanding of a situation has just reorganized itself around a new piece of information. "Mr. Pierce," Caleb said. His voice had changed. "You examined a copy. The paper stock analysis is valid regardless of—" "You examined a copy," Caleb said again. "Which means your expert assessed a reproduction. Which means his testimony about the composition of the original paper is—" He stopped. He looked at Margaret with something that might have been wonder if it hadn't been so close to fury. "Is worthless." Pierce's horse moved sideways. Pierce controlled it with a tightened rein, the only thing he controlled in the yard right now. His face had rearranged itself into something harder. The affable confidence was gone. What was underneath it was less pleasant. "Whitaker," Pierce said, "you do well to think carefully about what you're doing. That land has been in my family since 1874, Caleb said. And I have a signed agreement from 1878 that establishes the boundary you've been moving for 2 years. He paused. "And I have a lawyer who has the original, not a copy, the original, which your expert has never seen." Pierce looked at Margaret. The look was not dismissal now. It was something colder and more direct. "Your cook," he said slowly, "is remarkably well informed about legal documents." "My cook," Caleb said, "found the document you've been hoping didn't exist for 2 years. The yard was very quiet. Ethan Cole was standing near the barn. Pete Walsh had drifted out of the bunkhouse with the unhurried casualness of someone who happened to be in the area. Cal Briggs was visible near the water trough. Jesse was near the fence. They had not been there when Pierce rode in. They were there now. Margaret registered this without looking at any of them directly. She kept her eyes on Pierce. Pierce looked around the yard. He made a calculation she could see him making at the specific arithmetic of a man deciding whether the fight he came to pick was the fight he was currently in. He decided it wasn't. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," he said to Caleb. He pulled his horse around. "I imagine so," Caleb said. "And my lawyer will have the original document ready for him." Pierce rode out. The thin man followed him, looking relieved to be leaving. The yard was quiet for another moment. Then Pete Walsh said from near the bunkhouse entirely conversationally, "Is there coffee on Mrs. Ellis?" The tension broke. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific way that real tension breaks when the crisis has passed, and the people inside it remember that they are still people and not just participants in a conflict. Somebody exhaled. Somebody's shoulders dropped. Margaret looked at Pete. "There's always coffee on," she said. She went back to her bread dough. Bread. She heard Caleb behind her a moment later coming into the kitchen, and she didn't turn around. She needed a moment, just a small one, to put her hands back in the dough and feel the familiar resistance of it and let her heart find its way back to a normal pace. She had stood in that yard and done what needed doing, and she was not going to pretend it hadn't cost her something. It had. Her hands were not entirely steady under the dough, and she was glad the dough was there to hide it in. Margaret. Caleb's voice was different than she'd heard it before. Something had come loose in it. She kept working the dough. "The bread needs another 10 minutes. I'm not asking about the bread. I know. What you just did out there." "I asked a man a direct question," she said. He answered it with a look. "That's not something I did. That's something he did." "You knew," Caleb said. "The moment Ethan told you what Pierce was claiming, you knew it was wrong." "How?" She stopped working. She turned around because he was using the voice that deserved a direct response, and she had been raised to answer directness with directness. "Because I found that box," she said. "I know what the dust on it looked like. I know what the oilcloth felt like. I know what the crease in the paper had been doing for years. Nobody forged that document, Mr. Whitaker. It was real, and it was old, and it was exactly where your father left it when he forgot about it." She paused. "And when a man sends a hired expert who's only seen a copy and then calls the original a forgery, that tells you everything you need to know about how confident he actually is." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" "Please," he said. "Sit down. For 5 minutes. The bread can wait 5 minutes." She looked at him. She sat down. He poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her and sat across from her in the way he sometimes sat in the evenings when the ranch was quiet and the day was done, not as her employer, but as something the vocabulary between them hadn't quite gotten around to naming yet. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. And I want you to answer it honestly. Not the way you answer things when you're managing the situation the careful way, the honest way." She waited. "When you came here," he said, 7 weeks ago, did you expect to still be here now?" She thought about it, really thought about it the way he'd asked honestly without managing it. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because I hadn't been anywhere that long in 3 years," she said. "Since Thomas died, every place I've been has had a reason to send me away, or a reason I've had to leave. I stopped expecting to stay anywhere." She looked at the coffee cup. "I stopped letting Clara get attached because every time she did, we had to leave, and she had to unattach, and that's—" She stopped. "Hard on a child," Caleb said quietly. "Hard on both of us." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara drew a picture," he said. "She showed me last week, of the ranch." Margaret looked up. "She drew every building," he said. "The barn, the bunkhouse, the main house, every fence line." He paused. "She drew it from memory, with detail. The kind of detail—" He stopped. "The kind of detail that means she's been looking at it carefully. The way you look at something you're trying to hold on to." Margaret's chest did something she did not have a prepared response for. She left the back of the drawing blank, Caleb said. And I asked her why. And she looked at me. She has that look, your daughter. Like she's deciding whether you're worth the honest answer. I know that look, Margaret said. Her voice was not quite steady. She said she didn't want to finish the picture yet because she didn't know if it was going to be the right picture. He looked at Margaret. I asked her what she meant. She said her mama had left other pictures unfinished because they turned out to be pictures of places they didn't stay. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, someone was talking in the yard. Pete Walsh's voice easy and relaxed, which meant the morning had returned to its ordinary shape. Inside, something was happening that was not ordinary. Caleb, Margaret said. It was the first time she'd used his name without the formal prefix, and she heard herself do it and did not take it back. He looked at her. I need you to understand something, she said. I don't have the luxury of... She stopped, started again. I have a daughter who draws pictures and then leaves them unfinished because she's learned that hope is expensive. I came here with $42 and nowhere else to go. Whatever I've built here, the kitchen, the crew, the whatever this is, I built it because I know how to work, and because I had no other option. She looked at him directly. I need you to be honest with me about what you're saying right now. Because if you're saying something that's going to make Clara finish that picture and then take it away from her, I need to know that before she finishes it. Caleb put his coffee cup down. He looked at her with the full, steady attention that she had noticed from the first week, the attention that was not half present, not calculating, not waiting for its own turn. The attention that meant he was actually listening to all of it, including the parts she hadn't said out loud. I'm not taking the picture away, he said. She held that. I'm not, he said again. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm trying. I'm not good at this. I was good at it once a long time ago, and then Eleanor died, and I stopped having any reason to be good at it, and I've gotten... He stopped. His hands were around the coffee cup. Rusty. I've gotten rusty. Eleanor, Margaret said. My wife, 6 years ago. He said it the way people said things they had said so many times that the words had worn smooth. Not without feeling, with a different kind of feeling, the kind that had been processed enough to be carried without falling. I know what that's like, she said. I know you do. They sat with that for a moment. The particular silence of two people who have both lost someone and are sitting in the space that knowledge creates between them. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable. True. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, Caleb said finally. I'm not asking you to decide anything at all. I'm just... He seemed to choose the words deliberately. I'm just telling you that when I come into this kitchen in the morning, and you have the coffee on, and the fire going, and Clara is eating her breakfast with that serious face. He stopped. This ranch has felt like something different for 7 weeks than it felt like for 6 years before that. Margaret looked at him. That's a significant claim, she said carefully. I know it is, he said. I'm not making it lightly. She looked at her coffee. She thought about $42. She thought about 12 unanswered advertisements, and one answered one, and a stagecoach west through country that felt like the end of everything. She thought about Clara's unfinished picture. Ask me again in a month, she said. He nodded. All right. That's not a no, she said. I know, he said. It's an honest answer. I respect honest answers. She stood up and went back to her bread dough. He sat at the table for another moment and then went back out to his ranch, and the morning continued its ordinary shape around both of them, and neither of them said another word about it for 3 days. But something had changed in the air of the place. She felt it the way you felt weather, not with any particular sense, just with the full body of accumulated experience. Something had been named that had previously only been felt, and the naming had made it real in a way that could not be unmade. 3 days after Pierce's visit, Frank Dawson came to the kitchen. He came alone early before breakfast, which was not his habit. Margaret was at the stove. She heard him come in, and she did not turn around. Mr. Dawson, she said. He said, Mrs. Ellis. And then he didn't say anything else for a moment. She waited him out. She had gotten very good at waiting Frank Dawson out. "I watched what you did," he said finally, "when Pierce was here, with the document man." "You were in the yard," she said. "I wasn't in the yard when it started. I came out when Ethan came and got me. Told me what was happening." He paused. "I watched the whole thing." She kept her back to him. "Pierce looked at you like you were nothing," Frank said. His voice was different. She had not heard this particular quality in it before. "Like you were—" "I know how he looked at me," she said. "And you stood there, and you took him apart with one question." She turned around now. Frank Dawson was standing near the kitchen door, and he looked for the first time since she'd met him like a man who didn't know what to do with his own face. The contempt that had lived there for 9 weeks was gone, not hidden, actually gone, and what was underneath it was something considerably less certain. "I was wrong about you," he said. She looked at him. "I judged you the moment you got off that coach." He said it flat and direct, which she gave him credit, for some men wrapped an apology in so many qualifications that the apology itself was barely visible by the time they finished. "I decided what you were before you'd said a word. Before I'd given you any chance at all. And I made it hard for you, and I was wrong to do that." The kitchen was quiet. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "I know it doesn't change. I know saying it now doesn't change what I said and did before." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. I know that. But," she said. He looked at her. "It's still the right thing to say. And you said it." She held his gaze. People aren't always what they are in the first few weeks of knowing them. Sometimes there's something better that takes a little longer to come out. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face, not relief, not quite, but the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a weight he put there himself and has just been told he can set it down. "Your eggs," he said. "In the morning, you've been scrambling them." She raised an eyebrow. "I told you I'd remember fried for the next day. That was 9 weeks ago, Mr. Dawson." "I know." He shifted his weight. I never said it again because I was being stubborn, and they were good scrambled." He paused. "But if you weren't opposed tomorrow—" "Fried," she said. "I'll remember." He nodded. He turned to go. He stopped in the doorway and turned back, which seemed to take some effort. "Ma'am," he said. She waited. "The ranch is better with you in it." He said it fast and then left, and his boots on the porch were quick, like a man who'd done something he needed to get away from before he thought too hard about it. She turned back to the stove. She stood there for a moment. 9 weeks. 9 weeks of contempt and loaded silences and small cruelties delivered with plausible deniability, and the man had just stood in her kitchen and said the thing he needed to say. It wasn't everything. It was not a transformation. He was who he was, set in his ways, rigid in his judgments, slow to revise. But he had revised this one, and he had said so plainly, and she thought about what she'd told him. That sometimes people were something better that took longer to come out. She had believed that about him without knowing she believed it. She had believed it about this place. The month Caleb had asked her to take passed in the way time passed on a working ranch in winter, quickly, when she was busy, which was most of the time, and slowly in the specific way of cold evenings, when the work was done and the ranch was still and the kitchen was warm, and whatever was building between her and Caleb Whitaker was building in the quiet spaces between all the other things. He started coming to the kitchen in the evenings, not every evening, and never with any stated purpose, which she appreciated because a stated purpose would have made it into something that needed to be addressed rather than something that could simply exist. He would come in and pour himself a cup of coffee and lean against the work surface, or sit at the table, and they would talk, or not talk, and it was the most natural thing, and also the thing she was most careful about, in a way she couldn't entirely account for. They talked about the ranch. They talked about the cattle markets and the spring plans and what needed repairing when the ground thawed. They talked about Clara, who had started to follow Ethan Cole around on weekend mornings with the focused attention of a child who had decided someone was worth studying. They talked about Kansas and Wyoming and the particular quality of being far from where you started. She told him about Thomas one evening, not all of it, but enough. The accident the months after the grinding arithmetic of survival with a small child and no backup plan. He listened the way he always listened completely, without filling the silences with his own words. When she finished, he said, "He must have known you were extraordinary." She looked at him. "Thomas." "Yes." "Thomas thought I was stubborn," she said. "He used to say I would argue with a wall until it moved." "He wasn't wrong," Caleb said. She laughed. The real one again. He had been collecting her real laughs for weeks, she had noticed, because she noticed everything, and she noticed the particular quality of attention he paid to those moments, the way he treated each one like something worth being careful with. "Eleanor," she said, "an offering. Equal weight." He looked at the coffee cup. "She was gentle," he said. "The way I'm not. The way she could walk into a room where people were angry with each other, and the anger just settled. I never understood how she did it." He paused. "Clara does it too, actually. That quality. Different mechanism, but the same effect." Margaret thought about her daughter. Thought about the way Clara had slowly, without any apparent effort, made herself part of this ranch's daily life, not by being noticed, but by being consistently, quietly, genuinely present. "She has her father's eyes," Margaret said. "But I think she got the rest from herself." Caleb smiled at that. A real one. She had been collecting his real smiles the same way she'd been trying not to collect them, which was not working. It was the second week of December when Caleb came into the kitchen on a Tuesday evening and sat down and didn't say anything for long enough that she put down what she was doing and looked at him. "The court date is set," he said. "Mitchell got it moved up. Pierce's challenge is going to be heard in January." "That's good," she said. "Mitchell says it's solid. The document combined with the physical evidence of the moved markers which he's had surveyed, he says Pierce is going to have a very difficult time." "That's good," she said again. "It is," he said. He looked at his hands. "It is." He said it a third time quieter, and she understood that it wasn't the court date he was working toward. She waited. "I got a letter," he said, "from a woman in Denver, Millicent Crane. She's a..." He seemed to choose the word carefully. "She's a matchmaker. She writes to ranchers sometimes, looking for arrangements." He looked up. "I don't know how she got my name." Margaret's hands were still on the work surface. "She wrote a very sensible letter," Caleb said. "Listed several women she represents. Practical women," she said, "willing to come west. Good backgrounds." The kitchen was very quiet. "I see," Margaret said. Her voice was exactly level. "I didn't write back," Caleb said. She looked at him. "I read it twice," he said. "I thought about it. I thought about all the sensible reasons why a rancher who's been on his own for 6 years should probably think carefully about..." He stopped. "And then I thought about how you stood in this yard and took Harold Pierce apart with one question, and how you have never once in 10 weeks asked me for more than what you were owed, and how my daughter would have finished that picture by now." "Your daughter," she said carefully. "My daughter," he said. "Eleanor and I had a daughter, Grace. She's 4. She's been with Eleanor's sister in Cheyenne since the winter Eleanor died. She comes for summers." He paused. "She's coming in June." Margaret was still. "I should have told you sooner," he said. I haven't talked about her much to anyone. It's easier sometimes not to talk about the things that hurt where they can see you." He looked at Margaret. "You'd know something about that." "Yes," she said. "I would." He reached into his coat and put a letter on the table between them. The matchmaker's letter. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "I'm not writing back," he said. "I wanted you to know that." She looked at the letter. She looked at him. "You have a daughter," she said. "Yes. 4 years old. She'll be 5 in March. And she comes in June." "Yes." Margaret thought about Clara's unfinished picture. She thought about a 4-year-old girl in Cheyenne who had lost her mother and spent summers with a father who had gotten rusty at saying the things that needed to be said. She thought about $42 and 12 unanswered letters, and one that said, "Come, when you write to Grace's aunt," she said slowly. "When you write to let them know the summer arrangements." She stopped. She looked at the table. Then she looked at him. "You might mention that Clara is 7 and serious, and she has been known to share her composition book with children she decides are worth sharing with." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Is that a yes?" he said. Quiet. Not pushing. Asking. Maybe that's leaning," she said. "Which is more than I've given anyone in 3 years. He nodded, slowly, with the expression of a man who is receiving something carefully because he understands it is fragile and that its fragility is what makes it real. He picked up the matchmaker's letter. He looked at it one more time. Then he folded it deliberately and set it aside, and she did not watch where it went because it no longer mattered where it went. "The coffee's getting cold," she said. "It is," he agreed. She poured him a fresh cup. He stayed at that table for another hour while she worked, and they talked about the spring cattle plans and the condition of the north fence, and whether the school in Clearwater was going to hold its winter social in January or February. And all of it was ordinary, and all of it was charged with the specific electricity of two people who have just moved from one kind of thing to another and are still in the process of understanding what the new thing is. When he left, he stopped in the doorway. "Margaret," he said. She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for the month. Ask me how I feel about it in another month," she said. Something moved in his face that was not just a smile, something warmer and more serious than a smile, the expression of a man who has been lonely for a long time and has just been given something to look forward to. He put his hat on. He went out into the December night. She stood in the kitchen with the fire and the coffee and the quiet, and thought about Clara's picture still unfinished, waiting on the small table in the room off the pantry. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would tell Clara she could finish it. Clara finished the picture the next morning. She did it before breakfast while the biscuits were in the oven, and Margaret was managing the fire, and the first gray light of December was coming through the kitchen window. Margaret heard the scratch of the pencil from the small room off the pantry, that specific focused sound of a child who has decided something, and is acting on the decision without ceremony. When Clara came to breakfast, she set the composition book on the table beside her plate without comment, the way she did things she wanted her mother to notice but didn't want to make into an occasion. Margaret looked at the finished picture. Clara had added 2 more figures to the yard. A tall man with a hat, and beside him smaller, a little girl with her arms out like she was explaining something important. Margaret looked at the picture for a long moment. "Who's the small one?" she asked. Clara ate her biscuit. "Grace," she said. "Mr. Whitaker's daughter. She's coming in June." Margaret looked at her daughter. "He told you about Grace?" "He told Ethan," Clara said. "Ethan told me." She took another bite. "I thought it would be rude to leave her out of the picture if she's going to live here." "She doesn't live here yet," Margaret said carefully. Clara gave her the look, the 7-year-old look that meant, "I know what I know, Mama." "She will," Clara said simply, and went back to her breakfast. Margaret put the biscuits on the table and did not say anything else about the picture, but she left it open on the table while they ate, and she looked at it one more time before she cleared the plates, and she thought about a 4-year-old girl in Cheyenne who had lost her mother, and a 7-year-old girl in this kitchen who had learned not to finish pictures, and how the world had a particular way of arranging things that you couldn't have planned if you'd tried. The January court date arrived the way important things arrived in Wyoming, with no particular ceremony and a great deal of cold. Caleb rode to Clearwater with Mitchell 3 days before the hearing to prepare. Margaret ran the ranch in his absence with the same efficiency she'd been running the kitchen without being asked to, without making anything of it, simply doing what needed doing, because someone needed to do it, and she was there. The men had stopped finding this remarkable. That was, she thought, its own kind of progress. Pete Walsh, who was 20 years old and had been homesick since August came to her on the second day of Caleb's absence, with a problem involving the feed inventory that he'd clearly been worrying about for longer than he'd let on. She sat with him at the kitchen table, and they went through the numbers together and identified the issue and solved it in 40 minutes. He looked at her across the table when they were done with the particular expression she had come to recognize in young men on this ranch, the expression that meant, "I keep expecting you to be less than you are, and you keep not being that." "Mrs. Ellis," he said. "Pete. Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said. "I'll decide about answering." He turned the pencil in his hand. "Did you always know you were—" He stopped. Tried again. "When you were younger, did you know you were going to be the way you are? This capable?" She looked at him. It was a genuine question. She could hear the genuine in it, not flattery, not maneuvering. An actual young man trying to understand something about how a person became what they were. "No," she said honestly. "When I was younger, I spent most of my energy trying to be less than I was so other people would be comfortable." He frowned. "Why?" "Because the world does that to people," she said. "Especially to certain kinds of people. It tells them to take up less space. Be quieter. Don't want too much. And if you listen to it long enough, you start to do it to yourself." She paused. "It took me a long time to understand that nobody was benefiting from me making myself smaller. Not even the people who'd asked me to." Pete turned the pencil again. "What changed? Thomas died," she said, "and I had Clara, and I had $42 and no one coming to help us, and I had to decide in a very short amount of time whether I was going to be small or whether I was going to be whatever size the situation required." She looked at the table. Turns out the situation kept requiring quite a lot. Pete was quiet for a moment. "My mother would like you," he said. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is one," he said. "She's the toughest person I know." He paused. "She was the toughest person I knew, until now." She picked up the pencil and the papers and stood up. "Go check on the feed situation in the north barn," she said. "And then come back for supper. I'm making the beef stew." He grinned. The real one, the young one, the one that made him look like what he actually was, which was a 20-year-old boy who had come a long way from home and was slowly, carefully starting to feel all right about that. He went. She stood in the kitchen and allowed herself 30 seconds of feeling what Pete's words had done to the inside of her chest. Then she put it somewhere safe and went back to work. Caleb came back from Clearwater on a Thursday evening. She heard his horse in the yard, and she did not go out. She waited. She kept her hands moving because keeping her hands moving was how she managed the specific particular thing that happened in her body now. When she heard him return from somewhere, the thing she had stopped pretending was not there. He came through the kitchen door, and she turned and she saw his face. She knew immediately, not from any single feature, but from the total quality of his expression, the way a face looks when something that has been pressing on it for a very long time has finally permanently lifted. "It's done," he said. She put down the spoon. "Pierce," she said. "Pierce withdrew the challenge," Caleb said. "Mitchell says his lawyer looked at the original document, the real original under proper conditions with a proper examiner, and told Pierce he had no case. Pierce withdrew before it went before the judge." He stopped in the middle of the kitchen. He looked at her. "The boundary stands. The land is ours. The markers Pierce moved will be restored in the spring and surveyed officially. It's done." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Margaret said, "Sit down." He sat. She poured him coffee, and she poured one for herself, which she rarely did in the evenings. And she sat across from him, and for a moment they just held their cups and let the silence be what it was, not empty, not uncomfortable, but full of all the things that had led to this moment. The advertisement, the stagecoach, the storm, and Danny Reyes's leg, and the wooden box with the dust on the lid, and Harold Pierce's horse moving sideways in the yard while she asked a man a direct question and watched him answer with a look. "That document has been in that storage room for 15 years, Caleb said. "Yes. My father put it there and forgot about it. People do that. Pierce probably knew, he said. Probably figured it was gone or lost or that nobody would think to look. He looked at his coffee. He waited until I was running the operation alone. Until Eleanor was gone and I was managing everything myself and not looking at anything I didn't absolutely need to look at. He paused. He was patient. I'll give him that. He was very patient. Not patient enough, Margaret said. Caleb looked at her. He didn't count on me reorganizing the storage room, she said. Caleb's mouth moved. No, he said. He did not count on that. Nobody ever counts on the cook, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that had been building for weeks, that careful, steady, serious thing that she had been watching accumulate the way you watched a season change gradually, and then all at once. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. The letter I showed you, the matchmaker. She waited. Before I got it, before she wrote, I had already been... He stopped. He was not a man who stumbled over words often. The stumbling meant something. I had already been thinking about something that I didn't have the right to think about yet. Because you'd been here 10 weeks, and you'd come here for a job, and everything between us had been, I hadn't... He put down the cup. He looked at her directly. I didn't want you to ever think that I saw you as a solution to a problem, a practical arrangement, something I needed that you happened to provide. She was very still. I need you to know, he said, that what I feel is not practical. It is not about the kitchen or the document or what you did for Danny or how you stood up to Pierce. Those things they are part of it because they are part of who you are, and who you are is... He stopped again. You are the most capable person I have ever known, and you are kind in a way that doesn't announce itself. And you are honest the way very few people are willing to be honest. And I look at you across this kitchen every morning, and I think that I am looking at something extraordinary, and then you say something dry and funny, and I think there it is. There's the thing I was trying to say. Margaret looked at him. Her heart was doing something she did not have vocabulary for. Caleb, she said. I know it's fast, he said. I know, but I have been lonely in a particular way for 6 years, and I did not know what the alternative to that loneliness was going to look like until it arrived on a stagecoach in a dark blue dress with 2 travel bags and a daughter and said, "How many men am I cooking for?" He paused. I know what I want. I am not a young man who is confused about what he wants. I want you to stay, not as my cook, as... He looked at her. I want you to stay. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about $42. She thought about 12 closed doors. She thought about the stagecoach and the wind and the men laughing in the yard and the broken stove and the weevils in the flour and Danny Reyes on the kitchen table and the blizzard and the wooden box and Harold Pierce's face when she asked his expert a question. She thought about Clara's picture finished now with 2 new figures in the yard. She thought about a 4-year-old girl in Cheyenne named Grace. She thought about Thomas, who had called her stubborn and loved her for it, and left too soon, and about Eleanor, who had been gentle in the way Caleb wasn't, and who had made him a better man by showing him what gentleness looked like, and about how the people we lose make us into the shapes that fit alongside the people we find. She thought about what she'd told Pete Walsh, about making yourself smaller, about the situation requiring quite a lot. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. She felt him go still under her hand, the way a man goes still when he's been careful about something for a long time, and the carefulness is suddenly no longer required. I told you to ask me again in a month, she said. It's been more than a month, he said. I know, she said. I was counting. He turned his hand over under hers. Yes, she said. The kitchen was quiet. The fire was going. Outside, Wyoming was doing what Wyoming did in January, being cold and dark and enormous and indifferent to human arrangements. Inside, something had been decided that no Wyoming winter was going to touch. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He held her hand and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him in 3 months. And she thought, I am going to see that expression for the rest of my life, and she found she had no objections to that at all. They stayed at the table for a long time, just talking. The ranch, the spring, Grace's arrival in June, Clara's school, the north fence, the cattle plans. All of it ordinary. All of it changed, all of it carrying the specific weight of two people who have just agreed to build something together and are beginning to understand how large that thing is going to be. At some point, Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown hair, loose with the specific, unapologetic presence of a 7-year-old who has decided she would like a glass of water and is not going to let the fact that the adults are having a moment stop her from getting one. She looked at Caleb. She looked at her mother. She looked at their hands on the table. She went to the water pitcher, poured her glass, drank half of it with complete focus, and then looked at Caleb again. "Are you going to be here for breakfast?" she asked. Caleb looked at Clara with the expression of a man who was meeting something marvelous and knew it. "Yes," he said. "I think so." Clara nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already accounted for. "Good," she said. "Mama makes better biscuits when she's in a good mood." She went back to bed. The kitchen was quiet for exactly 1 second, and then Margaret laughed, the real one, the unguarded one, the one that came from somewhere below, all her careful management and control. And Caleb laughed with her, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh without restraint, and it sounded like something being released that had been held for a very long time. She thought, "I want to hear that sound every day." She did not say it out loud. She thought it was probably obvious. The months that followed built themselves the way good things build, not in dramatic leaps, but in the daily accumulation of small things done well and honestly. The kitchen remained hers. The ranch remained his. The space between those two facts became gradually and then completely shared territory. Caleb asked her formally in February. Not in the kitchen, he took her outside on a Sunday afternoon, when the cold had gentled slightly, and the light had that particular quality of a winter day that is already thinking about spring. He did not make a speech. He was not a speech-making man. He said, "I'd like to marry you, Margaret, if you'll have me." And she said, "I'll have you." And that was the whole of it, which was exactly right. She wrote to Thomas's sister in Kansas, who cried when she read the letter, and wrote back saying she'd known the moment Margaret left Kansas City that she was going somewhere she was going to be needed. Margaret read that letter twice and then put it in Clara's composition book for safekeeping. Clara, when told, said, "Can I still call him Mr. Whitaker?" "You can call him whatever you'd both like," Margaret said. Clara thought about this for a week with her characteristic seriousness, and then on a Tuesday morning when Caleb came into the kitchen before breakfast, said, "I've decided I'll call you Caleb for now. When I'm ready for something else, I'll let you know." Caleb looked at her over his coffee cup. "That," he said, "seems entirely fair." Clara nodded and went to get her school bag. Margaret put the biscuits on the table and did not let him see her face for a moment, because what was on it was too much for 7 in the morning. The legal business with Pierce concluded in March. The boundary markers were reset in April, officially surveyed, recorded with the county. Pierce did not come to the ranch again. His name appeared in conversation occasionally, the way a threat that has passed appears briefly without heat as a reference point rather than a presence. Mitchell, the lawyer, came out to the ranch in April to go over the final paperwork and stayed for supper and told Margaret over the beef stew that she had saved Caleb approximately 400 acres of the best grazing land in the county by finding that document. "I was reorganizing the storage room," she said. "That's a remarkable storage room," Mitchell said. "It is now," she said. "It wasn't when I got here." Ethan Cole laughed at that. He was sitting at the end of the table, where he always sat, where he'd sat every evening for however many thousands of evenings he'd eaten at this table. And he was laughing with the ease of a man who has watched something good happen and feels personally vindicated by it. Danny Reyes was back on his feet by March, 6 weeks on the leg like she'd predicted, and the doctor had come out twice to check his progress, and both times had looked at the original stabilization and said something complimentary that Danny repeated to anyone who would listen. He walked with a slight careful quality for a few weeks, and then didn't, and by April he was working the cattle again, and had written to Rosa in Colorado that when she came to visit the cook at the ranch, she would meet had hands that were better than any doctor's he'd ever seen. Rosa came in May. She was a bright small woman who laughed easily and looked at Danny with the particular expression of someone who has loved a person long enough to see them clearly and decided they were worth it. She helped in the kitchen without being asked, and Margaret liked her immediately with the directness that she liked most things quickly based on observation, without requiring more time than the evidence needed. "He talks about you constantly," Rosa told Margaret, rolling biscuit dough at the kitchen table on her second morning. "He says you saved his leg." "I stabilized a break," Margaret said. "The doctor saved his leg. He says you talked him through it the whole time, kept him from panicking." Rosa looked at her. "He says you asked him about me while you were setting the bone." "I asked him what he had to get back to," Margaret said. "You were the answer." Rosa stopped rolling. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was a little full for the biscuit dough. "Thank you," she said. "Roll it a little thinner on the edges," Margaret said. "They puff up more that way." Rosa laughed and went back to the dough. Grace Whitaker arrived in June on a Tuesday afternoon 3 days before the summer solstice on the same stagecoach line that had brought Margaret to Clearwater 10 months earlier. She was small for 4, almost 5, as she corrected everyone who said 4, with Eleanor's dark eyes and Caleb's angular face, and an opinion about everything that she expressed without hesitation or apology. She was carrying a cloth rabbit that was missing one eye and a small carpet bag that she refused to let anyone else carry. And when the stagecoach stopped and Caleb lifted her down from the step, she put both arms around his neck and held on with the specific fierceness of a child who has missed a person and is not going to pretend otherwise. Margaret stood back and let that happen. She understood what it was. When Grace finally released her grip on Caleb's neck and turned to look at the yard, she found Clara standing 3 feet away with the serious, assessing expression she gave things she was deciding about. They looked at each other. Grace held out the one-eyed rabbit. "His name is Samuel," she said. "He's old." Clara looked at the rabbit with appropriate respect. "How old?" "He was my mama's first," Grace said. "So very old." Clara nodded. This was clearly information that mattered. "Do you want to see my drawings?" she said. Grace looked at her with Caleb's measuring expression translated into a 4-year-old face. "Are they good drawings?" "Yes," Clara said, without false modesty. "They're very good." Grace considered this for approximately 3 seconds. Then she tucked Samuel under her arm and said, "All right." And the two of them walked toward the house together like they had an appointment. Margaret watched them go. She felt Caleb come to stand beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the June air. "She has Eleanor's directness," he said. His voice was quiet. "I noticed," Margaret said. "Clara will appreciate that. She doesn't have patience for people who are indirect." He looked at the doorway where the girls had disappeared. He looked at the sky. He looked at the yard, his ranch with its mended fence and its restored boundary markers, and its repaired stove, and its kitchen that smelled like something worth coming home to. 10 months, he said. "Yes. In 10 months he seemed to be running the list in his head. You fed 16 men through a winter. You stabilized a broken leg in a blizzard. You found the document that saved this land. You talked Frank Dawson into a human being." "Frank did that himself," she said. "You talked Pierce down in the yard with one question. His expert did that." "Margaret." She looked at him. "You rebuilt this place," he said. "I don't mean the supplies or the kitchen or the legal situation. I mean—" He stopped. "The men here, they're different than they were. Ethan is different. Henry Park eats breakfast now, actual breakfast every morning I've watched him. Pete Walsh stopped being homesick somewhere around December. I don't know exactly when, but I noticed when it was gone." He paused. "I'm different." She looked at him for a long moment. "You were already the man you are," she said. "I didn't build that." "No," he said. "But you showed it to me. Yourself, I mean. You showed me what it looked like, someone who was entirely themselves without apology in a place that hadn't asked for them. You showed me what that looked like when it worked." She thought about everything she had brought to this place. 2 travel bags, $42, a daughter with a composition book and her dead father's eyes, 3 years of closed doors, the ability to cook for 40 men in difficult conditions, the stubbornness Thomas had loved her for, the sighs she'd spent half her life being asked to apologize for, the voice she had stopped making smaller somewhere in the middle of a Kansas winter when she had understood finally and permanently that nobody was benefiting from her silence. She thought about what she'd carried through that yard on the first day and set down, not the bags, but the other things, the accumulated weight of everywhere she'd been that hadn't wanted her. And she thought about what she'd picked up instead. One piece at a time. One evening at a time. One biscuit. One cup of coffee. One direct question asked in a yard full of men who were finally paying attention. "I have a question," she said. "All right," he said. "When you wrote that advertisement," she paused, "what did you think you were looking for?" He was quiet for a moment. "A cook," he said. She looked at him. "I genuinely thought I was looking for a cook," he said. "I needed someone to feed my men. That was the actual practical problem I needed solved." He looked at the yard. "I wasn't looking for anything else. I don't think I thought there was anything else." He paused. "I think I had decided in a way I wasn't even fully aware of that there wasn't going to be anything else. That Eleanor was the one thing like that that happened to a man, and she had happened, and now I just ran the ranch. And then," she said, "and then a woman stepped off a stagecoach and asked me how many men she was cooking for," he said. "And she didn't flinch when I said 16, and she walked into a kitchen that had beaten 3 people before her, and she—" He stopped. He looked at her. "She made bread." "Bread," she said. "The smell of that bread," he said. "That first night. I walked in to check on things after supper, and the whole main house smelled like it was alive again. Like something was happening inside it that was worth coming back to." He shook his head slightly. "I know that sounds—" "It doesn't sound like anything," she said. "It sounds true." They were married on a Saturday in late June in the yard of the Whitaker Ranch, with Mitchell the lawyer standing up as a witness, because he had, as he put it, a professional and personal interest in seeing this particular piece of paperwork completed properly. Ethan Cole stood on the other side because he was the oldest friend the ranch had, and because he had told Margaret privately the week before in the kitchen over morning coffee, that he had known from the second evening when she'd asked Henry Park about his stomach and poured him a cup of ginger tea, that she was going to be the making of this place. She had told him he was being sentimental. He had told her that at his age he'd earned the right. Frank Dawson stood with the rest of the ranch hands in the yard. He was wearing a clean shirt, which for Frank Dawson was the equivalent of a formal gesture. And when the moment came, he took his hat off and held it to his chest and looked at the ground the way a man does when he is feeling something he doesn't have the words for and has decided that posture is the next best option. Clara stood beside her mother in a blue dress that Margaret had made from fabric she'd ordered from the dry goods store in Clearwater. Clara's color, she'd decided, was the same dark blue her own dress had been on the first day. And she thought there was something right about that, something circular and deliberate about the way certain things became markers of a life. Grace stood beside Clara holding Samuel the one-eyed rabbit, with the slightly formal seriousness of a child who understands that an occasion is occurring and is trying to give it its proper weight. She had taken her responsibilities as a witness extremely seriously, which she had self-appointed herself to be, after Clara explained that witnesses were the people who watched important things happen and remembered them. When it was done, when the words had been said, and Mitchell had recorded what needed recording, and Caleb had looked at Margaret with the expression she had decided she would never fully get used to, because getting used to it would mean she'd stopped seeing it. Grace tugged on Margaret's skirt. Margaret looked down at her. Grace held up Samuel. "Samuel says welcome to the family," Grace said with the precise formal diction of a child performing an official function. Margaret crouched down to Grace's level. She looked at the one-eyed rabbit, and then at the child holding him. Eleanor's eyes, Caleb's face, and something entirely her own that was already beginning to show through. Clearly something bright and direct and entirely unafraid. "Tell Samuel thank you," Margaret said. And tell him I'm very glad to be here." Grace considered this. Then she held the rabbit up to her ear with great seriousness, listened to whatever Samuel had to say, and nodded. "He says he could tell you were going to be good for us," Grace reported. "He says he knew from your biscuits." Clara, standing behind her, made a sound that was trying to be dignified and wasn't quite managing it. Margaret stood up. She looked at Caleb, who was watching this exchange with the expression she had come to love the most, the one that appeared when something moved him, and he didn't try to contain it when the careful management he'd applied to himself for 6 years was simply not operational, because what was happening in front of him was too real and too good to be managed. He reached out and took her hand. She let him have it. Ethan Cole said from behind them to nobody in particular, "Well, I'll be going to get the food." Because there was food, Margaret had made sure of it. 2 days of cooking enough for everyone on the ranch, and the guests from town, and Mitchell and the schoolteacher from Clara's school, who had come because she liked Margaret, and said so plainly, which Margaret appreciated. There were biscuits, and beef stew, and cornbread, and 2 pies that Clara had helped with, and coffee that wasn't burned, and everything that had made this kitchen what it was over 10 months of work, and patience and refusal. The yard filled with people eating and talking. The summer light sat long on the Wyoming grass. Clara and Grace disappeared into the house with Samuel and came back 20 minutes later in a state of mutual satisfaction that suggested significant negotiations had occurred and concluded successfully. Danny Reyes danced with Rosa in the yard, careful still, but present, his leg holding him up exactly as Margaret had said it would. Pete Walsh found a reason to check on the horses twice within an hour, which was his way of having a quiet moment, which she recognized and said nothing about. Henry Park ate 3 full plates of food and looked for the first time since she'd met him like a young man who was genuinely comfortable in his own body. Frank Dawson at some point in the evening came to stand beside her where she was watching the yard from near the kitchen door. He stood there for a moment. "Mrs. Ellis," he said. She looked at him. "Mrs. Whitaker," he corrected himself. And something in his face acknowledged quietly the full weight of what that correction meant, not just the name, but everything that had happened between the moment she'd stepped off the stagecoach and this one. The contempt, and the apology, and the fried eggs, and the day in the yard with Pierce, and all the 100 small adjustments that had taken him from the man he'd been to the man he was standing here being now. "Mr. Dawson," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. "This is a good day," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. This is a good ranch," he said. "It was always a good ranch, but it's—" He looked at the yard, at Caleb talking to Mitchell, at Clara showing Grace something in the composition book, at Ethan Cole standing with his coffee and his 20 years of loyalty, like a piece of the landscape that had always been there and would still be there when everything else changed. "It's better now. It's better than it's been in a long time." She looked at him. "It took all of us," she said, "to make it better. Not just me." He looked back at her. He knew she was right. He also knew she was being generous, and he was choosing to accept the generosity rather than argue with it, which was its own kind of growth. He nodded once. He walked back to the yard. Caleb came to find her a little while later, the way he found her without announcement, just arriving, as if her location was something he kept track of without thinking about it. He came and stood beside her and looked at the yard and the people in it, and the summer light doing what it did over Wyoming in June. "Are you happy?" he said. She looked at him. She looked at her yard. Her yard now, the word still new enough to carry weight, and her kitchen behind her and her daughter in the middle of the grass, showing a 4-year-old girl how to draw a fence line. And the men she had fed through a winter, standing in the evening, with their plates and their easy laughter and their comfort that had been earned, she knew partly by being seen and fed and taken seriously in the way that people needed to be taken seriously before they could settle. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 10 months ago with 2 bags and $42 and nowhere else to go, and the accumulated weight of everywhere that hadn't wanted her. She thought about who that woman was now. "Yes," she said. She said it the way she said things. She meant completely without decoration, without qualification, without making it into anything larger than what it was. A plain, whole permanent yes. Caleb put his arm around her. She leaned into him slightly, just enough, and they stood in the doorway of the kitchen that had been the beginning of all of it, watching their people in the yard in the long summer light, and the ranch that had been broken and was mended, and the children who were drawing fence lines together in the grass and the sky over Wyoming that didn't care about any of it and was beautiful anyway. This was what she had built. Not a perfect life, not a story without difficulty or loss, or the specific weight of carrying everything alone before someone was there to carry it with. But a real life. A true life. A life in which she had walked into a room that hadn't expected her and made herself indispensable, not by diminishing herself to fit it, but by being entirely and without apology exactly what she was, and finding that what she was turned out to be exactly enough, and then some, and then considerably more. Margaret Ellis had arrived at the Whitaker Ranch with 2 bags and a question. She stayed because the question turned out to be the right one. And the answer, when it finally came in this yard and this kitchen and this life she had built with her own 2 flour-dusted hands, the answer was better than anything she had thought to hope for in the dark years before Wyoming. It was not luck. It was not a rescue. It was a woman who refused to be small in a world that asked her to be, who walked through every closed door until she found one that opened, who fed 16 strangers until they were no longer strangers, who found a forgotten document in the back of a storage room and changed the shape of the future with it, who taught a lonely man to laugh again and a little girl to finish her picture and a young cowboy to eat breakfast and a stubborn foreman to examine his own soul. It was Margaret Ellis, and she was exactly where she had always been heading, even when she hadn't known where that was. Home.